John Adams is most famous for being the second president of the United States, but he was also a prominent attorney in the New England colonies. Today we'll be looking at the role that miscommunication and lack of communication can play in determining the outcome of major historical events. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Boston Massacre and the trial following it, where James Madison represented the soldiers and their captain in the court of law. At the height of his career as a New England lawyer, James Madison was given a choice. A case was presented to him of the soldiers and the captain of the British troops who committed the Boston Massacre, or at that time, who allegedly committed such a massacre. Madison's choice was simple. He could either accept a quid pro quo deal to get a seat in the Boston legislature in return for defending these men, or he could simply not further his political career, but also not risk his legal career by defending people who were frankly considered tyrants in the American colonies. Of course, we know that Madison did accept, and that after defending these men, acquitting all but two of them, and even for those two getting vastly reduced sentences, he did in fact get that seat in the legislature. What was interesting about this case, and interesting about any case dependent on testimony, is the stark differences in the testimony that was given. Because of this, we're going to be looking at two different testimonies that played a large role in the trial, as well as one additional testimony that adds a really interesting element that kind of spices up the rest of the early 1770s leading up to the Revolutionary War and served as a major piece of propaganda. So the first testimony that we were going to be looking at was from a deposition of Captain Thomas Preston, who was the commanding officer of this regiment of 8 men. Captain Preston's testimony definitely sides on the side of the British, as could be reasonably expected, given that he was a well-honored British commander. His testimony largely follows the narrative that for the entire day leading up to the massacre, the colonists were milling about the streets and becoming increasingly aggressive. Of course, at the time, there were increasing British troops and an increased British presence in major cities, especially like Boston. And so Captain Preston and his men were called out to essentially be riot police and keep the demonstrations peaceful and keep everybody safe to a certain extent. More specifically, as he put it, they were there to protect the king's interests, protect the interests of the crown, mostly by controlling the crowds and making sure that violence was not present in these demonstrations. The captain then goes on to say how when they arrived outside of one of the main townhouses, sort of like a meeting hall, he and his men ran into a group of demonstrating colonists, and that these colonists were extremely violent, and that they were making death threats against the captain and his men. And so they saw it fit to load their weapons and ready their weapons to fire. At this point, supposedly, according to the captain's testimony, the colonists began throwing stones and began throwing weaponized branches, clubs, essentially. Club also denoting in the historical context potentially some sort of metal end cap, which would definitely make it much more of a weapon and pose a much greater threat to the lives of British soldiers. And this is important to remember these fine details of the testimony. And so he went on to say that as these threats were being made and as these objects were being hurled at his men, the group of colonists moved up onto the position of the British soldiers and essentially started to swarm them and to overwhelm them. And at this point, the lives of the British soldiers were imminently at risk, and so they had to accordingly defend themselves. Specifically, a group of men slightly away from the captain, 3 specifically, the captain says, fired into an advancing group of the colonists, I believe one of which was killed instantly, based on historical records, but the captain does not specify. Using this testimony, we see that it was, in fact, a group of men who supposedly advanced, not just one man, and that 3 or more, a group of soldiers responded, not just one. So then we can take this information and move on to our next testimony, which was a man named Theodore Bliss. So Mr. Bliss's testimony slightly differed from that of the captain's. It was altogether the same narrative arc, but at the same time, the details were very different, and in a practical sense, greatly affected the outcome of the trial. So the first major disparity was with what was being thrown. Mr. Bliss states that the objects that were being thrown were snowballs, potentially ice balls, albeit, but not the large stones and boulders that the captain claimed, and also branches and sticks, not the connotatedly weaponized clubs that the captain stated. And so in this way, the British soldiers' lives would be much less at risk. But the biggest disparity of their testimonies is the position of the colonists, especially in relation to the safety of the British soldiers. And so Mr. Bliss states that the colonists were much further back, that they were not trying to advance, or if they were trying to advance, they were not rushing or swarming the British soldiers, and so in this way not threatening their lives. He makes no reference to whether or not verbal threats were being made. Considering it was a large crowd, it's fair to assume that there were insults being hurled. And then moving on to the last very large disparity is the case of the first shot. And I can say the case of the first shot because Mr. Bliss does not say that it was a group of soldiers reacting to a group of colonists. He says that, in fact, it was a single shot that rang out, and that was the beginning of the entire incident. And, in fact, that there was another solitary shot fired before the group of British soldiers opened fire. And so this is where we see the potential for a very, very drastic difference in guilt, or in implied guilt, because we could see in this case a skirmish between potentially 1 or 2 individual colonists with 1 or 2 individual soldiers, and where quite possibly a trigger-happy regiment then hears these shots and believes that a fire order has been called, and begins to fire upon the crowd. All the testimonies do, in fact, agree that the captain never did call a fire order. And so in this way, the captain was largely absolved of guilt, except for the fact that he was still considered in command of his men. And so these disparities are what lays at least part of the groundwork for the case that James Adams made against the complaint or the prosecution, the claim that these men were murdered in cold blood. So these differences in testimony really brought the reasonable doubt required to acquit. Well, we saw at least 6 out of the 8 soldiers and the captain as well. And additionally, the 2 men that were charged were not charged with murder, they were charged with manslaughter, and even within this manslaughter charge, they were given greatly reduced sentences, all based on the fact that there was no concrete evidence or concrete proof or continuity of testimony. And Madison actually cites that very specifically, that the testimony, the different testimonies just do not add up. In the end, it was this semantic twist, along with the discontinuity of testimony, that allowed 6 of the 8 to be acquitted of charges. What this acquittal meant, though, in a broader historical context, was that the American people did not get justice. The colonists did not get justice. And so the Boston Massacre was used as a major icon in the colonies against their British oppressors. It's interesting to think that if the other 6 of the soldiers had also been convicted, and potentially if all 8 had been convicted of murder, the colonies would have felt as if justice had been served. And though they may not have let the entire instance blown over, it might not have been used as quite the rallying cry that it was in leading up to the Revolution. In this way, the other events leading to the Revolution, and potentially the Revolution itself, could have been vastly different if these men had been found guilty. And potentially they could have been found guilty if James Madison had not taken this case. But altogether, this was a very strong instance in history where a potentially major historical line of events was shaped by the difference of communication and the disagreement of testimonies, which is a form of perception and communication, as well as through a semantic argument.